The barn door was open. That was the first thing FBI agent Marcus Hayes noticed when the team moved across the wet Georgia grass toward the old Hawthorne estate. The door was open, swinging slowly on one rusted hinge, and the morning fog was drifting through it like smoke. 3 federal agents walked past it without a second glance. A local deputy followed behind them, his boots crunching on the gravel, his radio crackling with static. Nobody stopped. Nobody looked twice. It was an old barn on an abandoned property in a small town where nothing ever happened. There was nothing there. But Titan stopped. The big German shepherd planted all 4 paws into the cold Georgia mud and did not move. His ears went flat. His body went rigid. And a sound came from deep in his chest. Not quite a bark, not quite a growl. Something between the two, something that Commander Sarah Bennett had only heard him make twice before in her life. Both times it had meant the same thing. Both times she had listened. "Hold," Sarah said quietly. The agents turned around. Hayes looked back at her with an expression that said they had already cleared the structure. Sarah did not look at Hayes. She was watching Titan. She had learned long ago that the dog was never wrong about silence. In Fallujah, he had stopped her outside a doorway that looked completely clear. There had been a pressure plate 6 and passed the threshold. In Kandahar, he had refused to enter a vehicle that every sensor said was clean. When Titan stopped, the world needed to stop with him. Sarah knelt down slowly beside him and put her hand on the back of his neck. She could feel the tension running through him like a current. She leaned close to his ear and whispered, "Show me, boy, show me." Titan looked at the barn floor. Sarah stood up and walked inside. The smell hit her first. Beneath the rot of old wood and Georgia clay, there was something else, something chemical, something that did not belong in a barn that had been abandoned for 11 years. She had smelled it before in field hospitals, in places where unconscious people were kept alive by strangers who did not care whether they lived or died. She looked at Hayes. "Give me a pry bar right now." "Sarah, we already swept this Marcus." Her voice did not rise. It never rose, but something in it made Hayes stop talking immediately. "Get me a pry bar." It took 4 minutes to find one in the equipment vehicle. It took 11 minutes to find the seam in the floor beneath 30 years of compacted dirt and rotting hay. And when they pulled the hidden hatch open and the flashlight beams cut down into the darkness below, Agent Hayes made a sound that Sarah had never heard a federal agent make before. It was not a tactical sound. It was a human sound. The sound of a man who had been doing this job for 19 years and was not prepared for what he was seeing. For children, all under the age of 10, lying on thin blankets in the cold dark, barely conscious, their lips cracked, and their small chests rising and falling in shallow, desperate rhythms. They had been down there for at least 48 hours without adequate water. The medical examiner would later say that another 6 hours, and the outcome would have been incomprehensible. Titan went down the ladder first. Sarah watched him move between the children slowly and carefully, the way he always moved around the injured, the way he had moved around wounded soldiers in places she never talked about anymore. He lowered his big head and pressed it gently against the chest of the smallest child, a little boy no older than 6, and the child stirred and opened his eyes and looked at the dog and did not scream. He reached up with one tiny trembling hand and touched Titan's ear. Sarah pressed her fist against her mouth and looked away for exactly 3 seconds. That was all she allowed herself. 3 seconds. Then she climbed down, got to work. That little boy's name was Liam Parker. He was 9 years old, and he would not let go of Titan's fur for the next 2 hours. Sarah Bennett had not planned to be in Willow Creek, Georgia. She had not planned to be anywhere in particular. After 21 years of Navy service, after 3 combat deployments, after a classified operation in the country she was still not permitted to name, that had left her with a rebuilt knee, 3 cracked vertebrae, and a grief she carried like body armor she could never take off. She had settled into a quiet life of consulting work and deliberate solitude. She lived 40 minutes outside of town in a house that had more space than she needed and less warmth than she deserved. There was a photograph on the mantel of a man in a dress uniform, smiling the way only people who know they are loved smile. She had not moved that photograph in 4 years, but she had stopped being able to look at it directly about 6 months after she put it there. Her husband Colonel David Bennett, had been killed in action in the Helmont province. He had died doing exactly what he believed in, which was a thing that made it both easier and absolutely impossible to accept. They had been married for 19 years. They had a daughter named Emily, who had her father's eyes and her mother's stubborn silence, and who had not spoken to Sarah in nearly 3 years. The rift between them was a kind that forms not in a single moment, but in 1,000 small ones. A missed birthday during a deployment, a phone call that went to voicemail during a crisis, a mother who knew how to breach a fortified position, but did not know how to sit still long enough for her daughter to cry. Emily had left Willow Creek at 18 and had not looked back. She was 21 now, studying trauma psychology in Atlanta, which Sarah thought was either deeply ironic or deeply hopeful, and she was not sure which. The only living thing that Sarah had not pushed away was Titan. He had been with her for 6 years. He had slept at the foot of her bed on the night the military chaplain came to her door. He had been there when she packed David's clothes. He had pressed his warm weight against her legs on the bathroom floor at 2 o'clock in the morning more times than she would ever admit to anyone. Titan did not need her to be strong. He did not need her to be okay. He just needed her to be there. And for a long time, that was the only thing she could manage. So when Marcus Hayes had called her 3 days ago and said there were missing children in Willow Creek and the FBI had no trail and no leads and nothing but a town full of terrified parents, Sarah had not hesitated. Not because she wanted to be back in the field, but because somewhere in her chest beneath the scar tissue and the silence, she was still the woman who had taken an oath to protect people who could not protect themselves. Some oaths do not expire. The investigation moved fast after the barn. Toxicology reports from the county hospital came back within 18 hours. The sedatives found in all 4 children's systems were not something purchased over a counter or mixed in a garage. They were pharmaceutical grade, precisely measured, administered with the knowledge of someone who understood pediatric dosages down to the milligram. Dr. Hannah Lewis, the attending physician who had treated the children on arrival, had flagged it immediately. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, she told Sarah quietly in the hallway outside the pediatric ward. This is not a random abduction. This is controlled, deliberate. Whoever administered these compounds had medical training at the highest level. Sarah stood in that hallway for a long moment. She looked through the window at the 4 children sleeping in their hospital beds. Their parents bent over them, holding their small hands, pressing their foreheads against their children's foreheads in that universal language of relief and terror that only parents know. Then she looked down at Titan sitting beside her, watching the same window with his dark, steady eyes. Who in this town has that kind of training? Sarah asked quietly. Marcus Hayes answered slowly, like he did not want the words to be true. There's only one person. Dr. Charles Whitmore was the most respected man in Willow Creek. He had delivered half the babies born in that county over the last 20 years. His name was on the wing of the hospital. He organized a Christmas toy drive every December, and his photograph was on the wall of the diner on Main Street alongside the veterans and the mayors and the people the town considered its own. He was 62 years old, silver-haired, soft-spoken, and universally trusted. He was also a monster hiding in plain sight. When Sarah and Hayes arrived at Whitmore's office to ask routine questions, Sarah watched his eyes. She had interrogated insurgents in black sites. She had sat across from men who had done unimaginable things and had smiled while doing them. She knew what a person looked like when they were performing innocence rather than feeling it. Whitmore performed it beautifully. His concern was calibrated perfectly. His answers were just slow enough to seem thoughtful. He even suggested that one of the hospitalized children might be a distant relative, an attempt to insert himself into the investigation and control the flow of information. Sarah let him finish. Then she leaned forward slightly and said, "Dr. Whitmore, where were you Tuesday night between 1,000 p.m. and 4 a.m.m.?" The pause that followed was exactly 2 seconds too long. He fled that evening, but before he disappeared into the tree and behind a property, he made a phone call to his attorney, Miss Kendall, who was later revealed to be a silent partner in everything he had done. And in that call, intercepted by federal surveillance, Whitmore said 7 words that turned Sarah's blood to ice. "There are more. Move the second group." The Whitman mine on Black Ridge Hill had been closed since 1987. The tunnels ran deep and dark and labyrinthine beneath the Georgia hillside, and in the lowest chamber, sealed behind a rusted hatch, Whitmore had hidden 3 more children. Sarah learned this from a partial map recovered from Whitmore's office by Hayes' team. There was no time to wait for a specialized unit. The air supplied to that chamber, according to the schematics, was mechanically controlled. Whitmore could cut it remotely. Sarah looked at Marcus. "I'm going in." "Sarah, we need to wait for Sarah. If he cuts that air supply, those children have 40 minutes. The specialized unit is 2 hours out." She was already pulling on her tactical vest. "I'm not waiting." She went in with Titan and a flashlight and 22 years of never leaving anyone behind. The tunnels were black and narrow and smelled of iron and old water. Sarah moved low and fast, her hand on Titan's back, letting him set the pace and the direction. He moved with absolute certainty through the dark, his nose working, his body a compass she trusted more than any instrument. Twice the tunnel forked, and both times Titan chose without hesitation, and both times he was right. They found the hatch in the lowest tunnel, 12 feet below a secondary shaft. Titan stood over it and looked up at Sarah with an expression she had seen on his face exactly once before in Kandahar, when it found 3 soldiers buried under rubble that no scanner had detected. It was not excitement. It was not aggression. It was something much quieter than either of those things. It was the look of a creature who understood the weight of what it just found. Sarah heard Whitmore's voice before she saw him. He was in the adjacent chamber connected by a narrow passage, and he had a remote control unit in his hand connected to the ventilation valve. His voice was calm, which was the most terrifying thing about it. "You're impressive, Commander. I'll grant you that. But this is over. Put it down, Doctor. I have spent 11 years studying the limits of human perception and canine instinct," he said almost conversationally, as if they were colleagues at a conference. "Your dog is remarkable. Genuinely. I want to understand what made him different, what made the bond between the two of you function at that level. It was purely scientific. You used children," Sarah said. Her voice was a flat line. "You used subjects who would not be missed quickly enough to." He did not finish the sentence. Titan moved before Sarah gave command, a precise and controlled takedown that put Whitmore on the ground and the remote unit skittering across the stone floor. Sarah was on it in 2 steps. She checked the valve, still open. She exhaled once slowly, then opened the hatch. 3 children looked up at her from the dark below. The oldest was 11, the youngest was 7. They were frightened and dehydrated and cold, but they were alive. All 3 of them looked past Sarah almost immediately and stared at Titan, standing at the edge of the shaft, looking down at them with his ears forward and his tail moving slowly. The 11-year-old girl whispered, "Is that a good dog?" Sarah looked at Titan. She felt something move through her chest that she did not have a name for. "Yeah, baby," she said softly. "That's the best dog." There was one more location. Whitmore, now in federal custody and facing charges that would end his freedom permanently, confirmed it during initial processing. 2 more children, a remote cabin on the eastern shore of Lake Hartwell. Sarah refused to send Titan back in. He had been in the tunnel for 3 hours, and she could see the fatigue in his movement. For the first time in 6 years, she argued with herself about his limits before she argued about anyone else's. It was Emily who found the cabin. Sarah did not know her daughter had driven 4 hours from Atlanta until she appeared at the FBI command post at the edge of the lake, her father's eyes in her mother's face, her hands shaking slightly, but her voice steady. She had seen the news. She had called Marcus Hayes, who had given her the location, because he knew things about Sarah and Emily that Sarah had never spoken aloud to him, the things that partners understand without being told. "I know this lake," Emily said quietly, standing 3 feet from her mother in the cold night air, the distance between them feeling both enormous and paper-thin. "I used to come here with Dad. I know where the old cabins are." Sarah looked at her daughter for a long moment. There were 1,000 things living in that look. For years of silence, a photograph facing down on a mantel, a voicemail that was never returned, a mother who did not know how to be soft, and a daughter who had needed her to learn. None of those things were spoken. There was no time, and perhaps no words adequate enough. Sarah simply nodded and said, "Show me." They found the cabin together. Titan identified the correct one from 30 yards out, pulling forward on his lead with quiet insistence. Inside, two more children, a brother and sister, 8 and 10 years old, were huddled together under a single blanket, frightened but unharmed. When Titan pushed through the door and crossed the room to them, the little girl buried her face in his fur and began to cry the way children cry when they finally feel safe. Not quietly, but with their whole bodies, as if releasing something they've been holding since the moment the danger began. Sarah stood in the doorway of that cabin and watched her daughter kneel beside the children and speak to them in a low, calm voice, the voice of someone who understood trauma, not just academically, but personally. She watched Emily's hands, steady now, moving gently. She watched, and she felt something in her chest that she believed was gone forever slowly, painfully begin to return. Outside the cabin, in the beam of a flashlight left resting on a tree stump, Titan found a buried case beneath the cabin's back steps. Inside were documents, files, years of recorded observations, the full evidence of Whitmore's obsession. It was everything the federal prosecution needed. Miss Kendall was apprehended at the county line 2 hours later, the last thread of a network that had hidden itself behind a good name and a generous reputation, and a town's unconditional trust. Willow Creek, Georgia took a long time to heal. Towns always do after something like this. The kind of betrayal that comes from inside, from the people you trusted most, leaves a different kind of scar than the kind that comes from outside. But it does heal slowly, imperfectly, the way all real healing happens. 3 months later, on a quiet Thursday morning in early spring, Sarah Bennett sat on the porch of her house 40 minutes outside of town. The sun was coming up over the treeing, slow and golden, the way Georgia mornings do when they are not in a hurry. Titan was lying across her feet, his gray muzzle resting on her ankle, his breathing deep and even. He was older now. They both were, but he was still here. The door behind her opened, and Emily came out with 2 cups of coffee. She sat down in the chair beside her mother and handed her one without saying anything. They sat together for a while in the kind of silence that is not empty but full, the kind that exists between people who have begun to find their way back to each other and do not yet need words to know they are on the right path. Down the road, a car pulled up and Liam Parker tumbled out of the passenger side before his mother Clara had fully stopped, running across the yard toward the porch with the unrestrained joy that only a 9-year-old who has been given his life back can run with. Titan's tail began to thump against the porch boards before the boy was halfway across the yard. "Titan!" Liam called out, breathless and grinning. "Titan, I brought you something." He had brought a tennis ball, bright yellow, slightly deflated. He held it up like an offering. Titan lifted his gray head and looked at it with the measured dignity of a decorated military working dog who had cleared tunnels and tracked criminals and saved 7 children's lives in 36 hours. Then he stood up, walked down the porch steps, and took the ball gently from the boy's hand. Sarah watched them. She felt Emily's hand rest lightly on her shoulder. She did not pull away. At the new trauma recovery center on the edge of town, the one that bore Emily Bennett's name on the door, and it opened its doors to the first families just 2 weeks prior, there was a small bronze statue outside the entrance. It depicted a German shepherd sitting alert, ears forward, looking ahead. The plaque beneath it read simply, "He heard what others missed. He stayed when others walked past in memory of every guardian who protects without being asked." They had wanted to give Titan a medal at a formal ceremony. He had received his military commendation with the quiet indifference of a dog who had never done any of it for recognition. He had done it because it was his nature, because loyalty was not a decision he made. It was simply what he was. There's something that 21 years of military service will teach you if you let it. It will teach you that courage is not the absence of fear. It is a decision to move forward anyway in the dark with nothing but a dog you trust and an oath you have not forgotten. It will teach you that the people we lose never fully leave us. They live in the photographs we cannot look at directly, in the eyes of the children we raise, in the silence we carry, and in the faithful creatures who stayed beside us through every moment of it. And it will teach you that healing is not a destination. It is a direction. And sometimes all it takes to start moving in that direction is one dog who refuses to take another step until you pay attention to what he is trying to show you. Titan heard what no one else heard. He stopped when everyone else walked past, and because of that, 7 children came home. Never stop paying attention to the ones who cannot speak. They are often the ones telling you the most important thing. If this story moved something in you today, if it reminded you of someone you have loved, someone you have lost, or something you believe in, then you are exactly who this channel was made for. We tell these stories because they deserve to be told, because the people behind them deserve to be remembered. If you are not yet part of the State of Valor family, hit that subscribe button right now and join the thousands of Americans who believe that courage, loyalty, and sacrifice should never be forgotten. And if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. This is State of Valor. We will see you in the next one.